A Plague Tale Requiem is not just a game, it's an experience which will stay with me for a long time. On its surface, it masquerades as your typical narrative-driven AAA title. It has bombastic set pieces, high-quality performance capture, action stealth combat, and plenty of slow-walking dialogue. Yet, much like its predecessor, it's far from conventional. It was made with less than half of the budget and half of the workforce of an industry-standard safe-bet blockbuster. Yet, it ambitiously aims for the same highs as its mega-hit counterparts. This game is a gamble, one where success hinges on playing to a unique set of strengths, letting its limitations breed innovation in order to stand out. The burning question then emerges: has A Plague Tale Requiem ascended to its ambitious peaks? Or has it flown too close to the sun and fallen from grace? Well, off the bat, I can say that Requiem surpasses A Plague Tale Innocence in achieving its intended goals. The most striking change to the experience is that the restrictive design in Innocence is now opened up, and freedom is a core philosophy of the gameplay loop. Encounters are no longer a single solution puzzle disguised as a choice. Perhaps more importantly though, the narrative does some more interesting things, and presents itself more seriously. The game pulls this off by being more grounded in its presentation of the world and its characters. This allows it to succeed in the communication of more ambitious themes. I'm talking particularly about Amici's arduous relationship with violence. The story in Requiem begins in a very similar place to Innocence, where peace is disturbed by Hugo's premacular disease. This is the driving narrative force in the setup. But things quickly change when Hugo has a dream of a cure, which defines a new quest paved with violence to overcome his affliction. The premise serves as a conduit to watch Amicia and Hugo navigate tribulations together as brother and sister, and oh man, I don't need much more of an excuse to experience another journey through their compelling relationship. The most interesting element of the narrative though, from my point of view, is the link between storytelling and the gameplay systems. The range of relationships in the game, especially that between Hugo and Amicia, are reinforced by interactions the player makes throughout the journey. It goes as far to put the thematic killing blow into the player's hands, an approach which is sorely underutilized in video game storytelling, putting the developers, Asobo, into a unique position as a game studio. Not everything is a Mediterranean paradise here though. There are flaws which hold it back. Some characters should have been left in the first game, and some gameplay decisions should have been refined rather than thrown in the rubbish bin. The biggest sting for me though are the elements which aren't necessarily worse, but are less interesting by virtue of a trend to adopt the tropes of other AAA narrative-driven games, rather than building on what made A Plague Tale unique in the first place. Despite some loose threads, Requiem is a beautiful showcase of the massive potential of a studio relatively new to games of such a broad scale. The game is impressive in its technical execution of what an interactive world offers, with an off-the-hook rat system and environmental fidelity matched only by studios with access to far more resources. But the true value of a studio is measured by its trust of ideas, and with the way narrative and gameplay braid together in A Plague Tale, in a way I wish I would see more often, Asobo has shown that it has a wealth of creative value. So, let's get handsy and really inspect what's changed here in how the Plague Tale sequel plays. Like I mentioned, the game feels much better to play. The game director, Kevin Choteau, made it clear in many pre-release interviews that he was well aware of the key weaknesses in Innocence. Chief among them is the restrictive design of puzzles and combat encounters. He was written about in a book composed shortly before the release of the game, detailing the development of both releases. It's called The Heart of a Plague Tale, a visual making of, by Benoit Renier. In the book, Choteau is discussed having shifted the design philosophy to move away from single solution situations. He says, quote, "We want to move away from the philosophy of the first installment, according to which each area had only one correct solution. We want to give players more tools so they have greater freedom, but without overcomplicating the game phases." End quote. The solution to this problem was to develop a toolset whose various pieces can interact with each other, spawning a complex range of potential outcomes from a simple item list. The game has emergent gameplay now, and it changes the feel of encounters more than you might think. It's a real upgrade in freedom. So let's have a look at Amici's shiny new toolset. There's been significant streamlining here, so abilities with one-off uses, like Luminosa, are gone. We keep Ignifer for lighting fires, Extinguish for putting them out, and Odorous, otherwise known as Crack for rats. And then we get one new alchemy, with Tar, which makes fires temporarily brighter. For more offense, a lethal crossbow now supplements Amici's sling as well. It seems quite simple, but the complexity comes about in how they can be used together. For example, combining a pot with tar will leave behind a flammable pool which can be set alight to kill enemies or make a path around rats. More tar could then make this brighter to distract enemies for a quick escape. And with levels designed to accommodate the new toolset, you can do things like put out a fire to fill the space between you and an enemy with rats, giving you safety while you scope out the area. You can also set up some really clever traps now. The environment reacts to your alchemies in ways that you can leverage into combat options. For example, you can throw a jar of tar at an enemy holding a torch, and his whole body will be set alight. You can also set dense grass on fire to take out a lurking guard, but then you lose out on a hiding spot. So combat offers decisions in how you can exploit your tools and the environment to work in your favour, and you're constantly weighing up your choices. The range of options makes thinking a possibility now during encounters. This also bleeds into navigation within the rat puzzles throughout the game, where there are often multiple ways to get around a rat colony. The best option might depend on your resources, or hell, maybe you just enjoy setting rats on fire more than giving them drugs. The fact that there's options now introduces more layered problem solving, which makes puzzles feel more meaningful and satisfying. Amicia builds up a powerful command over light via her toolset, and the rat puzzles are much better for it. For example, in this area, you can choose to combine your Ignifer alchemy with the crossbow and light up a path for you to get through the rats. And those dynamically positioned lights can be further brightened by throwing tar to open up the path even further. There's a rich set of permutations in how alchemies, equipment, and the environment can be combined together to pull off some really creative solutions during puzzles and combat. The pacing at which new puzzle tools are introduced, as well as the alchemies themselves, is really well calculated. I always felt like something new came up as soon as the current systems were beginning to get stale. Don't worry though, there are certainly some elements in the game which do get stale. The focus in the early game is on stealth. Again, this is carried over from Innocence, and combat design makes enemies generally very challenging head-on, especially if they're in a group. So you're incentivized to remain out of sight, and rely on your brain in how the new toolset is applied. It fits the kind of person Amicia is. I mean, she's a teenager dragging around a kid who gets distracted by frogs. But as you get towards the late game, the range of combat upgrades, and especially the crossbow, turn her into a medieval John Wick, and combat is trivialized. There's very limited ammo for the crossbow, but by the time you upgrade it to be able to recover arrows from bodies, murdering all of the enemies in your path becomes the easiest way to approach combat, and there's no more incentive to use the environment in clever ways anymore. The late game combat design is self-sabotaging and defocuses itself from its most interesting aspects. One caveat is that this does tie into the narrative thread of Amici's growing violent outbursts, but I still don't think the combat equation is quite balanced in the right direction here. The upgrade and resource systems aren't necessarily a straight improvement here either. Take the workbenches. To upgrade your gear, you need to find a workbench to spend your upgrade resources. This is a nice design in principle, but just like in Innocence, they're far too common for the number of upgrades in the game. Overall, the upgrades are more substantial here, and they can make your combat abilities genuinely more powerful. However, the upgrade to skip the use of workbenches is still here, and I don't know why. It's antithetical to the implementation of workbenches for upgrades in the first place. Unfortunately, the worst issue is yet to come, with the new playstyle-based skill upgrade system. Workbenches are relegated to the upgrades of tools and equipment, while skill upgrades give you access to new physical abilities, like being able to push enemies into fires. The way it works, as the game presents it, is that depending on whether you tend towards one of 3 different playstyles, either of aggressive, opportunistic, or prudence, you'll gain skill upgrades in the corresponding upgrade branch. So, what do each of the playstyles actually mean in terms of what you physically have to do in the game? No, seriously, I'm asking. I have no idea. The game doesn't give you any more information beyond those 3 single words: aggressive, opportunistic, and prudence. I had to look up how this actually worked in forum posts from people who experimented with these skill upgrades. A lot of people were saying that it just depends on how you play, i.e., the game would be tracking a list of actions to determine your playstyle. Do you remain in stealth a lot of the time? Do you kill people aggressively? Or maybe you use a lot of environmental interactions to distract and kill enemies. I thought the same thing too. But I tried to be stealthy and use a lot of opportunistic traps, and I still ended up getting a lot of upgrades in the aggressive skill branch. When I did some more digging, I found that the way it actually works is that it's based only on how many enemies you kill in each area. Yeah, that's literally it. If you kill a large proportion, you get progress in the aggressive skills. Kill a moderate amount and you get opportunistic, and killing few enemies nets you prudence. There's even a Reddit thread which tells you exactly how many guards you have to kill to optimize your opportunism skill tested for every single encounter in the game. The fact that the game never tells you this is crazy to me. I was confused for my entire first playthrough since it felt like no matter how I played, I wasn't getting the upgrades I wanted. The real issue here is that you can have examples where you never get detected, but you stealthily kill a lot of enemies. This gets you progress in aggression, which are combat-based abilities, like being able to stun people for longer with your sling, and you get nothing in prudence, which is what enhances your stealth options. Those aggression abilities are useless to me if I play in stealth the whole time, regardless of how many people I decide to kill. I don't like focusing on nitpicks, and I think the problem with the skill system is larger than it appears from the outside. These skill upgrades condition you into playing a certain way to try and get certain skill upgrades. When you don't end up with the upgrades you want, you feel disincentivized to pursue certain playstyles, and this bleeds into the satisfaction of combat encounters. I'm not sure what the best solution really is. Tracking an amorphous playstyle is hard. How do you distinguish between someone who is stealthy and kills from the shadows from someone who uses guerrilla hit and run tactics to clear an area? Perhaps the types of kills could be factored in, whether they're from the sling or from alchemy, for example. It doesn't seem easy, I admit, but the way that it was ultimately implemented just doesn't work for a large range of playstyles. So yes, the upgrade systems grapple with some challenges, but the open-ended design is a success for Plague Tale. It's not just the toolset which has been expanded though. The level design has as well. This is true for combat encounters, which tend to be pretty extensive areas with lots of Swiss cheese-like branching paths to follow depending on your playstyle. But what's interesting to me is that this openness is used for an exploration section as well, which is when the game attempts a semi-open world area about 2/3 into the game. I don't think it's a leap here to say that this is very clearly inspired by modern Naughty Dog design, where these open world areas come up in confined links along a chain spanning an otherwise linear game. Uncharted 4 was the first game that used this style, and it's been repeated in Uncharted Lost Legacy and The Last of Us Part 2. It also behaves similarly to the semi-linear hub worlds in something like God of War. I think A Plague Tale Requiem doesn't quite pull it off as well here. The level is really big in comparison to anything else in the game, and it takes a long time to traverse it when you can only run. There are no cars or horses like in Uncharted or The Last of Us. There's also not really much to explore. The level begins by funneling you through a very simple puzzle. You come across a statue of a phoenix, and if you follow the direction it points, it leads to another phoenix, then another, and so on, until you reach the center of the open world area, where you get a cutscene showing you where you need to go to progress the story. At this point, you could go straight to the next area after a pretty lengthy walk, and skip the vast majority of this section. If you decide to stay though, there are some collectibles, loot, and some light puzzles, all of which appear in similar forms throughout the linear section, but are now dotted throughout this wide area. There is one unique inclusion here though, the likes of which appear nowhere else in the game. A massive environmental puzzle has you figuring out which of these 4 windmills has to be turned either on or off. You figure out the pattern by coming across 4 shrines which dot the open area, telling you what the on-off pattern is. Or you could Google it if you get sick of running around the island. The reward, though, is pretty substantial compared to what the game usually gives you for going out of your way. A cave opens up and you can find a brace which gives you a permanent combat upgrade, and this is the only way to get it. This puzzle is really interesting. It's really cool to use the wide space in a way that the linear components of the game wouldn't be able to. But this is the only interesting aspect of the open area. The small collectibles and loot that you can find require running long distances to span a search across the entire level. So you just end up running to 4 corners of a massive open area. Of course, this is optional, but if you have video game brain like me, you can't help but search as thoroughly as possible under the risk of missing out on something important. There's no enemy or rat encounters here either, so not much happens between the widely separated points of interest. All of the time you can potentially spend in this area means that the pacing of the game comes to a complete halt. This is also in the middle of an already slow section of the story. At this point in the narrative, Amicia and Hugo are somewhat aimlessly searching the island for anything that might lead to a cure for Hugo. So having to explore at a much slower pace than usual as a player does make some sense. But it swings too much in this direction that the urgency of the narrative falls away a bit, and there's not much interactive variation in a long line of picking up loot and solving mostly standard environmental puzzles. As I mentioned, the reason this kind of level is here is pretty clear. Uncharted is mentioned by the game director as a strong inspiration for Plague Tale, and Uncharted has been praised for the expansive sections added to their linear journeys in its last 2 installments. More generally, there appears to be a broad trend to borrow a lot of the tropes from recent AAA game design as Asobo is moving from a Plague Tale Innocence to Requiem. If you look at the resource system, Innocence had a shared resource pool used for both weapons and upgrades, so you had to be careful not to overuse your resources in fights, so that you would be left with enough to upgrade your equipment with in the long term. However, the balance was off, and abundant resources with very few worthwhile upgrades meant that the resource system didn't quite work as well as it could have. The way the solution for this was approached in Requiem was to totally abandon the interesting design of a shared resource pool and do exactly what most other action-adventure games like Horizon and The Last of Us do by having a dedicated resource type for upgrades, separate to those used for crafting alchemies. There's still very abundant alchemy resources in Requiem, so you're never weighing up whether you should save resources for a harder fight. The answer is always yes. Use everything you've got, because there's more around the corner, even on the harder difficulties. Requiem also introduces knives which break upon use. They can either be used for a quick stealth kill, or to access upgrade resources locked in workbenches throughout the journey. This is exactly the same system as used in The Last of Us. It's not like these new systems are fundamentally flawed or anything. They work perfectly well in the other games I mentioned, and it's very smooth and palatable in Requiem as well. It's just that it's closer to being the same thing as everything else now. There are less unique ideas being attempted in Plague Tale. Now, I don't know if this is a result of the roughly double-sized budget over Innocence pushing the game to take less risks, or whether this is simply closer to the game that Asobo wanted to make in the first place. But to me, this is indicative of a trend towards homogeneity in modern blockbuster game design. Game development is so complex and expensive these days that publishers have become extremely risk-adverse. This is honestly the most disappointing thing to me about Requiem overall. It feels like a considerably less risky game. It makes me wonder if this is a general trajectory for Asobo, or whether it was the pressure to make a more marketable game. It's for this reason Requiem often feels like a game which struggles to strike a balance between innovation and conformity. The author of the Plague Tale Making Of book puts it well. Quote, "Increasing the budget and size of the team does not automatically make the game better or easier to develop. In fact, it can be quite the opposite. The greater the ambitions for a project, the greater the ramifications and consequences behind each decision made." End quote. The unique approach to gameplay for a linear story-driven, cutscene-focused game in Innocence was one of the things which made it enjoyable to experience. Stealth and ingenuity was incentivized, though that ingenuity was rather simple. That's not to say unique games in the AAA-esque space don't exist. Death Stranding, for example, is wholly unique in its core gameplay design, but these types of experiences are very few and far between. Now, despite how I'm talking, I don't have anything against big-budget AAA games. some of my best friends are AAA. The thing is though, variety is a core ingredient for innovation. So the more variety there is, the more growth there is for games as a medium. And I wish there was more of a place for large-scale games to go off script a little bit more. For now though, it seems that indies are where the innovation is at. The use of existing trends actually sometimes works in Requiem's favour. The game is full of spectacular Uncharted-like set pieces. They're bigger than ever and are really impressive in how they leverage the technology behind the rat system. This time around, up to 300,000 rats can be on screen at a time, a massive upgrade in scale over the 5,000 in Innocence. What's incredible though, is how rats are used at such a large scale and remain visually uncluttered. It would be unbelievably easy to just throw hundreds of thousands of rats at a screen, filling it with visual noise to flex some technical power. But the composition and flow of the numerous rat chase set pieces in the game are genuinely masterful. They end up serving to be a visual spectacle that match the diatone and emotional weight of the game. And hey, they still end up flexing the technical prowess of Asobo as a studio. The rats were already one of the most successful elements of the first installment, and the way that they're used in this game is bigger and better than ever. A climactic rat chase usually comes at the end of a high-tension story beat, so they're used at strategic moments in the narrative to punctuate the game's pacing. Their careful design pays off in the broader context of the game experience. If rats are the most ambitious technical elements, then the most ambitious design element is to attempt storytelling through gameplay systems and mechanics. I've talked before about narrative and gameplay existing separately from each other. What I mean is that most games have the same narrative experience whether you watch a playthrough or whether you're the one actually playing the game. Occasionally though, the way the modes of interaction are framed around the characters and world can have a profound effect on the narrative experience, and Requiem attempts to braid storytelling and gameplay together, at least to some degree. The primary gameplay loop already shows an example of this. While it's true being given increasingly wider options to inflict violence on enemies begins to trivialize encounters later in the game, this premise tempts the player to lash out, similar to Amicia's struggles with self-control in the story. A Plague Tale Requiem has more to offer in its approach to combining storytelling and gameplay, which I'll get into later, though it only occurs in occasional patches over the bulk of the game. Regardless, as I was experiencing this narrative synergy in Plague Tale, I was reminded of a game I've played before, which takes this concept to its absolute limit. So, to explain what I'm trying to say here, let me turn to a game which was critically praised on its release in 2013, for doing something incredibly unique at the time. A game about a relationship between two people. A game called The Last.
Wait! No.
Sorry, I must have got my notes mixed up. I actually mean Brothers, A Tale of Two Sons. If you haven't heard of it before, go away and play it. It's incredible and should be experienced by anyone who cares about artistic expression in games. Actually, I'd preferred it if you stayed, so I'll leave a timestamp up if you want to skip any spoilers. In any case, Brothers, A Tale of Two Sons is an adventure game about, you guessed it, two brothers. They go on a journey across a Scandinavian-inspired fantasy world in order to find a cure for their dying father's illness. This is also the first game directed by Joseph Fares, known for directing It Takes Two. I have nothing but respect for the guy, and it's no stretch to credit him with pushing the limits of storytelling in the games that he's made. Brothers transcends traditional storytelling boundaries by having a narrative which is in large part told through the gameplay mechanics themselves. A huge part of this premise is how the controls work for the game. You play as the two brothers, at the same time. The left stick controls the movement for the older brother, and the left trigger is his interaction button. The younger brother is controlled by the right stick and trigger. The bumpers control the camera, and that's the full control list. The controller is essentially split in two halves, and each half corresponds to a different person. The unique control scheme is used for a lot of interesting puzzles and traversal challenges throughout the game. One of my favourites is when you have to climb up a giant tower with the brothers, who are attached to each other via a rope. You have to position one brother as an anchor in order for the other to swing into place. Then their roles swap, and you repeat the process in a harmonic ebb and flow. All the puzzles in the game exploit the control scheme to require both brothers working together to solve problems. Mechanically, it's all about managing the simultaneous control over two characters in order to see what are sometimes unintuitive solutions only possible by getting the characters to work together. Narratively, you witness the strengthening of their sibling relationship and the importance of working together to be stronger than the sum of two parts. Sound familiar? Oh, and did I mention the game has no spoken words? There's a fictional language used in the game, so technically there are voices, but there's no explicit dialogue. So all of the character and relationship development happens through the animations and the gameplay. Having to be the one physically manipulating the interactions between the brothers brings you, as the player, into an intimate position with the characters, and there's a wonderfully unique tactile mode of engagement with their relationship. It's not a symmetric relationship though. The older brother is stronger and can pull heavy levers, and the younger brother is smaller and can slip through tight bars. They fill in each other's respective weaknesses. So it's not just any pair of adventurers who can make it through this journey, but specifically these two. They are two parts of a whole, as communicated by the need for both of their unique abilities to progress through the game. One of the mechanics where this is clearest is with the swimming. In a few parts of the game, the brothers are forced to traverse water. This comes with a serious issue though. The younger brother witnessed the drowning of their mother, and so he never learnt to swim. The older brother can swim though, so in water, you need to get the younger brother to grip onto the older brother as he swims them both to safety. Allowing them to drift apart is a game over. It's a short game at about 3 hours, but at the end of the story, so much has happened between the two brothers that it still manages to deliver an emotional gut punch. Just as the brothers are about to find the cure they're looking for, the older brother gets stabbed by a spider lady, and he's destined for death. The younger brother tries his best to save him, giving him some of the mystical remedy intended for their father, but it doesn't work. You play as the young boy in a drawn-out segment as he buries his brother. You start to notice something odd here. At this point, the game's initially counterintuitive controls have cemented themselves into your muscle memory. So it immediately throws you off balance to have a whole half of the controller without any function. Something feels fundamentally missing. You actually feel the loss of the older brother through the mechanics of the game. But the flagship moment comes shortly after. You still need to deliver the cure to your father after all that's happened. And this happens to require navigating a body of water. But hang on, the younger brother can't swim. If I use the right side of the controller, the one which has always been for the younger brother, he won't walk beyond the shoreline. That is, until you use the left side of the controller, and suddenly the young brother musters up a strength he's never shown before. With full exertion, he struggles across the water in a miraculous effort to get to the other side. The bittersweet ending then comes after reaching the boy's father. He's saved by the remedy, one life traded for another. But the game tells you this isn't a story only of loss, but also one of growth. The message is told in the most powerful example of mechanics as a form of storytelling I've ever seen. Ask anyone who's played this game, and no matter how long ago it was, they'll remember exactly how they got the younger brother across the final stretch. That one moment is arguably the entire point of its 3-hour journey. When I played this game for the first time in 2013, I was a teenager. I had a younger brother who, at the time, I felt a sense of protection over. He struggled with school, and neither of us had a father around. I ended up feeling a self-appointed duty to help him as much as I could in life. Finishing that game hit me like a truck. The idea that a sibling relationship had the power to impart this kind of growth in a person resonated with me massively, and it wouldn't have been nearly as successful without the ingrained connection between storytelling and gameplay. This is why Brothers: A Tale of Two Sons remains unique even today, and very few games get anywhere close to this level of interconnected video game storytelling. It's hard to ignore the fact that Brothers, much like Plague Tale, is also about building up an emotional sibling relationship, but it manages this successfully in fewer than 3 hours with no explicit dialogue or text and very few cutscenes. It's a testament to what can be achieved by going all in on this concept of gameplay as a storytelling device. In this vein, I want to talk about the most successful element of the game experience in Plague Tale, which has always been to be a part of the growth of the sibling relationship between Amicia and Hugo. This extends to the characters which accompany the pair through their journey too. Well, sometimes at least. The relationships are primarily established through dialogue and moments in cutscenes, but a respectable degree of this comes from gameplay interactions. One of the best examples of this is how commanding Hugo or another companion to help with puzzles or combat is mapped to a dedicated button. By holding the left bumper while looking at a contextual element in the environment, a prompt will come up allowing for a character other than Amicia to interact with it. For example, if you do this while looking at a small cavity that a 5-year-old would be able to fit into, you can command Hugo to go in and open up a room. This can simply open up hidden areas, or it can be a solution to a traversal puzzle. It integrates with combat too, since someone like Lucas can turn fires into billows of sparks and smoke to distract enemies for a quick escape. The fact that there's a button that you can always access, which gives you interaction with the world through another character, contributes towards the gradual build-up of the game's relationships. It certainly helps as well that each companion has unique interaction that communicates a part of their characterization. Of course, Hugo can crawl into tight spaces, and Lucas uses his alchemy skills. But there's also Arnaud, a big bulky knight who you befriend that can kill enemies in combat on command. Another new character, Sophia, is a charismatic seafaring pirate. She uses one of her probably stolen gemstones to focus light and set grass on fire for a combat distraction. These abilities organically blend into the familiar interactions within the game world. There's a kind of reliance you end up developing on certain characters, which is a part of what allows an understanding to form outside of the more expositional writing. The system is not groundbreaking, but it's a nice addition and makes playing through the game a part of the narrative experience. Things, in fact, go a little further with Hugo. We all know he can control rats, but it's taken to a new level in this game where you can use Hugo's rat abilities directly from his perspective in combat. If there's a line of sight to a group of rats, you can use Hugo to enter the rat's point of view and run around devouring soldiers. Narratively speaking, this is an interesting move. In the midst of a story about Hugo struggling with losing control to the macula, you have the option to take advantage of its power. There's a stress meter that runs up as you use Hugo's rat abilities, which means that you, as a player, are having to balance Hugo's usefulness at the cost of his innocence and sanity. And if the game is effective in getting the player to sympathize with Hugo in the story, then this is a genuine trade-off as a gameplay decision. Although it might be technically easier, purely mechanically, to abuse Hugo's rat powers as much as possible, there's an emotional block in doing so, unless you're heartless and cold inside. The quantity of encounters which allow you to control rats is small enough that it doesn't feel like combat is trivialized by this either. The struggle reflects exactly the conundrum Amicia finds herself in with Hugo. She witnesses everyone around her trying to take advantage of Hugo's powers, despite the fact that there's no good argument that a child should be exposed to this level of violence. It happens with Arnaud, who takes Hugo under his wing just to try and use him to kill for personal revenge. The main antagonist of the game, the Count, establishes a cult around the child on his island. It just so happens that he eventually decides he wants Hugo for his destructive power as well. A group of insurgent slavers on the island also try to appease Hugo so that their faction has the Macula's power on their side. From every direction, Amicia witnesses the reckless disregard for Hugo's life in the pursuit of power. But at the same time, her incessant will to protect him drives her to become more reckless and violent herself. All of this makes it incredibly impactful when she herself encourages Hugo to kill in her own moments of rage. Violence becomes a language of Amicia and Hugo's relationship, in Amicia's ironic attempt to keep him safe. While this story is told through the narrative proper, The design of Hugo's rat powers and how it interacts with the gameplay communicates the exact same message. That the scale of Hugo's power is the very reason he'll never be safe or able to reclaim his innocence. The narrative design also extends into the way collectibles are handled in the game. And honestly, they are some of the most well done I've seen in a video game like this. I really think they're perfect here. I'm not talking about the loot and crafting items. No, what I mean is the world-building collectibles. In Innocence, there were objects you could find like old coins or religious items that had in-menu descriptions. They weren't interesting at all compared to the flowers that you could find that Hugo had an interest in. Every discovery of a flower in that game characterized Hugo so fully within such a simple device. Well, Requiem goes even further. It completely removes the boring lore items and replaces them with souvenirs. These are moments in the game which spark a conversation between Amicia and another character, or just a monologue from Amicia herself, centered around a discovery within the environment. For example, here, Amicia comes across a collection of silk with Lucas. In Innocence, this would just go into a menu and have some text explaining what silk is. Truly a thrilling thought. What happens here though, is that we get some insight into Amicia's personality.
Lucas, look! Real silk.
She marvels over the stuff. The conversation then ends up shifting to curiosity about whether the plague exists in China and the rest of the larger world. It leads to genuinely interesting dialogue about the characters and the world. Amicia mentions the death of her father, which was a pivotal moment in the first game, only a couple times here. One of these times, though, is during a souvenir discovery of a gravestone, which reminds her of her dad. I think this is just brilliant. The souvenir discoveries give surprisingly deep character insight, and even give closure for serious moments in the narrative. Some people might say here that the fact that some of the most touching moments in the game are hidden in small missable side content dampens the impact. But I think it's the exact opposite. The fact that these moments are missable makes them all the more special when you come across a meaningful moment in the game, not in a cutscene, but instead just as you're poking around the environment. Not only is it incredibly rewarding, but it gives this sense that there's a lot going on in these characters' heads all the time, since they interact emotionally with the environment, at times and in ways that you don't necessarily expect. I just love this so much. The flower collectibles are similar here as well, but they've been swapped to feathers. Hugo's rapid heel turn to a new fascination matches perfectly with his childlike energy. And the dialogue between Amicia and Hugo when they come across these moments are as wholesome as ever, and help to build and refine my perception of the sibling relationship as an observer. With character relationships being one of the central pillars of the game, the souvenirs and collectible feathers tie exploration to narrative brilliantly. The way collectibles work is also used to play with player expectations as a storytelling mode. For example, throughout both Plague Tale games, Hugo has always been excited by flowers and feathers, regardless of how dire things have become. But as his doubt grows to its worst, he loses interest in the world around him. When you try to cheer him up the next time you come across a feather that would normally melt away his despair, he couldn't care less. The reason this is so effective is that it breaks the player expectation. This is similar to what happens when Hugo's mind is completely clouded by the macula later in the story. Throughout the game, Hugo is always making sure to be by Amicia's side, holding her hand. There's a wonderful animation which gives a sense of comfort and peace whenever Hugo or Amicia finish interacting with something where Hugo comes running up to lock fingers with his sister. However, when Hugo gets mind-wiped by the macula, it's told in the cutscenes, but felt in the way that the expectations are subverted around Hugo's in-game interactions. The player might not have even noticed that Hugo is almost permanently attached to Amicia's arm, but I can guarantee that everyone will notice its absence. I am genuinely impressed with the way that Requiem uses its gameplay systems to aid in telling the story. But there's one more thing on this topic which has me somewhat confused. The making of book mentions that companions can die in combat, and this was intentional to make them feel more like real people, and to make the world feel more threatening. This is unlike a game such as The Last of Us, where companion characters are essentially invisible to enemies and invulnerable to death. I find it interesting that we've gone around in a full circle, where companion death in action games used to be the status quo. It was a common complaint at the time. The Last of Us and Bioshock Infinite are still praised to this day for having great companions in gameplay, since they were basically invulnerable. But now, there seems to be a thought to reverse this again. The implementation in Requiem is fortunately not annoying, since it happens quite infrequently, and you always have plenty of time to save someone. But then, the consequences of this are that the system's not present enough to change the feel of the characters or the world, and it just ends up in this bland middle point. Regardless, it's an interesting example of a set of deliberate choices to try and make the gameplay synergize with the narrative as much as possible on top of the otherwise conventional third-person action-adventure gameplay. The approach to gameplay has a real impact on improving the quality of the narrative experience, but it only really works if the narrative is good to begin with. The good news is that Requiem's writing is much better than that in the first game. The bad news is that some of the plot-driving moments make little sense. It's really the brother-sister relationship here that gives Plague Tale its heart, and Requiem handles this wonderfully. This is in no small part due to the voice acting and performance capture. The voice work clears an even higher bar this time around, with Charlotte McBurney and Logan Hannon reprising their roles as Amicia and Hugo. But clearly, they've gained more experience and their performances are even more impactful and engaging. I think this is especially true for Hugo. The performance capture is a marked improvement as well. The larger budget means that more work has gone into not just the character models, but also the facial and body animations during cutscenes, bringing a prominence to the physical acting. The characters emote more convincingly now, which makes the performances unambiguous and believable in a way that they weren't in Innocence. In fact, this was Innocence's biggest visual drawback, and while Requiem isn't industry-leading or anything, it's still impressive that a small studio like Asobo can compete on a similar level to much larger games in terms of performance capture. I particularly like this scene, where Amicia is struggling to let Lucas sneak off on his own into a group of soldiers. Amicia is worried about him while also contending with her own internal anger against the enemy faction at this point in the game, who are standing in her way of finding a remedy for Hugo. I can actually feel her anxiety, and this is possible just from the visual aspects of the acting, which, just to be clear, is not done by McBurney, but instead by Amicia's performance actor for face and body capture, Robin Wolfe. Ultimately though, what really makes the narrative stick the landing is the fact that Requiem is a much more grounded game than its predecessor. In particular, it makes the ending work really well. In fact, I would say that the ending is the best part of the game, with a thematic consistency that the first game never achieved. I want to talk about the significance of the ending, but before I do that, I need to discuss the impact of the plot up until that point. The beginning of the game has Amicia, Hugo, their mother Beatrice, and Lucas on the road together after the events of the first game, and they end up in southeast Mediterranean France. The making of book mentions that this was a very deliberate change in setting from Innocence, since the Mediterranean gave an opportunity for much brighter and more colourful environments. I think this pays off brilliantly. Requiem, more often than not, delivers an experience which transports you to a very unique part of the world. The environments are full of sun-baked stone masonry. You run through lush, dense floral pastures, and the ocean laps against the rocky shorelines. So, yes, the environments look just beautiful, a stark contrast to the bleakness brought by the rats as the game progresses. Going back to the game's opening, Amicia and Hugo are suddenly attacked in a beekeeper village, and the ordeal reawakens the macula in Hugo. This sets up the premise that his emotional state is tied to the outbursts of the macula. He passes out and dreams of waking on the shore of an island. A mystical phoenix leads him to a pond, and just as Hugo thinks he's dying, the pond's water cures his disease, instilling a thought in him that he still has some hope. Hugo tells Amicia of his dream and passes that same hope on to her. The group later finds a town in which they seek help from a member of an ancient organization called the Order, who knows about the history of the macula. Mr. The Order mentions that Hugo will inevitably die due to the macula, and for whatever reason, the thought of the death of her fucking son doesn't seem to faze Beatrice at all. Anyway, it's during this process that we start to see the toll that the events of the first game have had on Amicia, as she struggles with the trauma of losing friends and killing to survive. Her trauma has transformed into an uncontrollable violent streak, and there's a sequence which does a great job of showing this. This is immediately after her anxiety dance, and Amicia finds Lucas in a shed with the plant that they need. They could just run away, but Amicia stays back to mow down over a dozen enemies in a misplaced sense of revenge for Hugo's suffering, despite Lucas's protests. This is actually fantastic. Not the murder, no. I mean the way the game has you play out the showcase sequence for Amicia's struggle with violence. It's a play don't tell approach where the game lulls you into a flow state of slinging rocks into guys' heads before it shakes you by the shoulders to say, "This isn't right, you know." It's another example of how the game passes a lot of the story's messaging onto the gameplay. After the endless murder, Amicia and Lucas get captured and have to escape back to town. Their stay in town is short-lived though, as Hugo's presence brings the rats, which, in a spectacular set piece, has the entire town leveled, implicitly killing many. The group has to relocate, and Beatrice decides to go to Marseille, where there are more people from the Order. However, Amicia wants to try and find if Hugo's coma dream island is real and look for a solution to the macula. Amicia and Hugo find an opportunity to break off from Beatrice and Lucas and go on a quest for the island. This is where we see some of the best moments between Amicia and Hugo. I really love all of the passive dialogue and interactions between them. It's all of these smaller moments that really build the believable bond between the brother and sister, and it's only if this bond is believable that the rest of the game will work. Specifically, the consequences of Amicia's struggles with controlling violence are told through their relationship. At this point in the game, Amicia is finding it hard to carry on due to a head injury from a scuffle with Arnaud earlier on. This culminates in a sequence where Hugo has to control swarms of rats to kill an endless wave of enemies to protect himself and Amicia. Amicia tells Hugo to use his powers to kill, but the things he's saying makes it feel like this is a cathartic moment for him. Hugo's primary mentor is Amicia, and he's only ever seen her through the lens of violence, originally out of necessity, but now out of anger, and he's inheriting the same aggression. The sibling pair meet Arnaud, the ex-knight who was fighting against Amicia's group earlier on in the game. But now, he promises to help them find the island with his pirate friend Sophia. After sailing with Arnaud and Sophia, the island does turn out to be real. It's called Lacuna, and it used to be run by the Order. Now, however, it's run by a count and his wife Emily, who have fostered a cult around the next coming of the Macula's carrier. On the island, Sophia, Amicia, and Hugo discover that the Macula is a cyclic event occurring every few hundred years. They uncover a story about the previous carrier, a young boy named Basilius, who had a destined protector by his side, Aelia. Looking into the past, Amicia sees a reflection of herself and Hugo, where her role as a guardian for Hugo was some kind of destined fate. Now, personally, this is the most frustrating narrative choice that the game makes. The fact that Amicia has some kind of uncontrolled destiny to form a protective bond with Hugo undermines all of the hardships which formed the bond in the first place. And, of course, the growth of their relationship is what defines the beauty in the Plague Tale games. It's not a fatal decision for the plot, but it's a layer which unfortunately weakens the impact of what already works. In any case, Amicia continues to learn about the story of the previous carrier. The Order feared him due to the danger posed by his powers, and decided to lock him up alone, separating him from his protector. Aelia ends up dying in a fight to reunite herself with Basilius, and when the boy finds out about the death of his protector, he loses his mind to the macula, and dies unleashing the Justinian plague in the process. After this discovery, Amicia and Hugo realize that the island has no cure for the macula after all, and that Hugo's dream was just the macula playing with his mind, drawing the pair out to the island. Rats eventually start appearing over Lacuna, so the pair try to leave. On the way, they run into Beatrice and Lucas, but before they can all leave together, the Count and his wife Emily try to take Hugo for their own, since through their cult, they believe that they have a right to Hugo. Amicia tries to stop the Count, and learns that he made everything up about the cult to comfort Emily, who's infertile and struggles with her sanity.
And not only did she believe it, she turned it into hope for the people.
You fed her alive!
Despite this, Emily kills Beatrice in order to have Hugo for herself.
I'm so proud of you.
Oh my god, finally. Hugo goes on a rampage, killing waves of people, and eventually Emily, through the encouragement of Amicia. The Count, distraught after Emily's death, manages to escape the chaos. Amicia, Hugo, Lucas, Arno, and Sophia all make their way off Lacuna together on ship. The Count catches up to the group and steals Hugo away after a fight. The group washes up on shore where Arno sacrifices himself to save Amicia, and Amicia bonks the Count on the head. He dies. During this fight, Hugo believes Amicia to be dead, so the macula takes control and a dark fog begins to blot out the sun. Unlike the first game, there's no main villain here. The real conflict is in how Amicia and Hugo are trying to fit into a world which is not able to accept them. They can't settle down lest rats eat everyone around them. They can't live in peace because there's always someone else desperate for Hugo's power. This struggle is represented by the macula itself, which threatens to tear Amicia and Hugo from each other despite their efforts to prevent it. There is, of course, an antagonist in the Count, but he's less of a focus than, say, Vitalis is in the first game. So that's the layout of the plot up until before the ending. Some critics who disliked the last game's late game shift to magical rat powers have expressed concern that Requiem follows in the same path. I, of course, have talked about my issues with the story in Innocence, but there's a wider sentiment that if you dislike the outlandish story in the first game, you won't like it here. I have to say, I very much disagree with this. The one part about Requiem's mysticism which I wasn't a fan of is the destined fate of Amicia as Hugo's protector, but my overall impression of the narrative direction in this game is very positive. Actually, I would go as far to say that the existence of the first game actually does a lot of the heavy lifting in Requiem, in allowing its story to be taken seriously. The thing is, the more outlandish elements of the world building, while problematic in the first game, have now been established. So, by virtue of the first game existing, Requiem, on its own merit, avoids inheriting the flaws of the ungrounded jump to rat magic, as well as Amicia's very quick path to becoming a bloodthirsty killer. Essentially, Requiem starts off with an established setting, where we know and accept, however begrudgingly that may be, that Hugo has a supernatural disease which allows him to control rats. This game's story is then told on top of this established set of rules. Unlike the first game, there's never really a moment where these rules change, nor are there any goofy rat tornadoes, so the game remains grounded throughout its runtime. It also helps that a lot of the superficial elements in the game are grounded in our reality. Asobo had an onboard historian to have some alignment with real history. A lot of the environmental details, like the butcher's markets and town architecture, mirror real medieval French history. Even if you aren't a historian yourself, when you're playing through these environments, the dedication to history aligns with an innate expectation of what this time period looks like, and the world feels more relatable. This approach is blended really well with the game's fantasy elements in a kind of harmony. For example, Basilis existed during the Justinian Plague, a plague that took place in our real history, but in the game, it serves as a backdrop for some of the fantasy lore. There's a delightful balance between history and fantasy, which grounds the supernatural elements of the game and allows the stakes of the narrative to be taken more seriously than if these historical elements were treated with less care. Being more grounded, the game has tried to tackle some more serious themes as well. There's something the game's trying to say about violence, and this is a really interesting topic in the medium of video games. While it happens, it's not often that a game whose core gameplay loop revolves around inflicting violence upon others actually takes the time to reflect on the consequences of giving in to these violent tendencies that the game so tantalizingly offers up to you. I've talked about how Amicia's conscienceless murder has had an impact on Hugo. He's already lost his innocence in A Plague Tale: Innocence, but that doesn't mean there isn't further to fall. Hugo, unlike Amicia, has a lot of empathy for strangers and the wider world around him. The whole reason they get attacked in the opening of the game is because Hugo wants to stop and help another kid, despite Amicia's pragmatic suggestion to move on. He still sees beauty in the world. The beauty he sees fades though, as he's forced to engage with the world through violence. Why does this happen? Well, a lot of it's out of anyone's control. His disassociation is fueled through watching Amicia inflict violence in front of him. Amicia's actions do not simply stop at the boundary of her own self. It's easy for your actions to impact and influence those around you, especially when there are people that depend on you. Bringing attention to the consequences of violence is a hard thing to pull off naturally. Other games like The Last of Us Part 2 and Spec Ops: The Line, for example, are praised for being able to provide some serious commentary on the dangers of blindly doling out quote-unquote justice. In A Plague Tale: Requiem, it works for me, and it only works because this game takes care and time with providing a grounded world in which to tell its story, and it therefore requires a lot less effort to take the story seriously. This doesn't mean that all of the narrative elements in Requiem are flawless though. The way that some of the secondary characters are handled honestly baffles me. There are some good things here. Lucas is great again. If anything, he's underused. He disappears 1/3 of the way through the game because Amicia straight up abandons him. And it's not like Lucas wasn't trying to be supportive either. My impression is that the writers knew they'd have trouble balancing too many characters in the second act of the game and put Lucas in their crosshairs for this. But his exclusion ends up feeling entirely out of place, and you feel that loss since he's one of the most likable characters. Instead, we meet Arnaud and Sophia, two adults who bring a fresh dynamic. Sophia especially serves as a mentor, guiding the siblings through challenging situations. Arnaud, though, gave me some real narrative whiplash. Despite being a respected knight in the past, he now operates under his own jurisdiction, but he does so with a group of men who follow him. His clan clearly means a lot to him. He calls them his friends in a very sincere monologue.
The Count's army is at war with us. The scum of Provence. Most of my men, my friends, have been killed or ran away.
You first meet Arnaud after killing a bunch of these men of his. Like, a ton of them. You set them on fire and stuff. It's fucking brutal. After seeing all of this, it makes you wonder what kind of miracle in writing makes Arnaud go from chasing Amicia down for the murder of his men to wanting to work together and help Amicia and Hugo. Well, the answer is nothing. No, really, there's never a mention of this, let alone a resolution to it. Arnaud's only motivation here is to use Hugo to kill the Count, but this doesn't excuse the lack of consideration for the significant detail of Amicia having killed so many of his men. The closest they get to acknowledging this awkward part of their relationship is when Arnaud recognizes Amicia's ignifer alchemy from when she used it on his men. No apologies are given, no criticisms are shared. You'd think that she was using those ignifers to keep his men warm at night for him. This is the strangest part of the game's writing by far, even stranger than the abandonment of Lucas. And the issue with all of this is that Arnaud is otherwise a great character. He has wonderful dialogue with Hugo and acts as a convincing mentor for him. Arnaud betrays Amicia when he tries to use Hugo to kill the Count for him, but redeems himself later for this when he sacrifices his life to save Amicia and the rest of their group. All of this is meant to mean something, but the elephant in the room surrounding Amicia's mass murder of his friends makes it harder to engage with Arnaud as a real character. An easy defense of this is to simply say that the extent of the violence Amicia inflicts on Arnaud's men happens in gameplay and not in the story proper. In other words, to use some vocabulary straight out of 2013, it's all just ludonarrative dissonance. For Plague Tale though, at least in Requiem, this excuse doesn't fly. The reason is, well, the game tries really hard to tie the storytelling into the gameplay. You can't have Amicia kill a bunch of soldiers in a gameplay sequence to tell the story of her emerging bloodlust and then ignore the fact that she's murdered dozens of Arnaud's men. Either then, the game is inconsistent, or there's an uncomfortable disassociation between how Arnaud treats Amicia and what Amicia has done. Either way, the result is a game that presents a confusing kinship between these characters, which undermines the rest of Arno's otherwise well done character. Oh, and one last thing about the characters. Beatrice. Beatrice is a total fuck up, and the game never acknowledges it. She's not in the game for long, but what she accomplishes is to be unsympathetic to Hugo's imminent death, to refuse to help Amicia and Hugo in their journey to seek out a cure, to reunite with them in an emotionless reunion where she's neither relieved to see them nor upset that she was abandoned, and then finally she gets killed, which only serves the purpose to disturb Hugo's emotional state such that the macula can begin to take over and advance the plot. Despite some of the issues with how some of the characters fit into the story, all in all, the narrative is a massive step up from Innocence. This is helped by the intent to fold the gameplay systems and sequences into the narrative. Amicia's descent into violence is both believable and effectively portrayed as she strives to save and protect Hugo. This brings us to the ending. Upon finishing the game, I felt like I was missing what it was actually really trying to say, and I think it's just really subtle without the full game in retrospect. The bulk of the game has you experience elements of familial love and the power and partnership, but these don't feel like the main messages you're left with after putting down the controller. Instead, the game is really trying to tell a story about how Amicia was blinded by her love for Hugo and her hope for a cure. It's about the futility of control and the importance of acceptance. The very ending of the game has Amicia delving into the heart of Hugo's tempest of rats in order to find and save him. After solving a couple of abstract riddles, which are really important and I'll talk about soon, she finds Hugo. But it's not a happy moment, since you soon realize that Hugo has come to a decision in the time you've been apart. He shows Amicia all of the people they've implicitly killed just by existing, and asks Amicia to end his life for him. So, she does. Or, well, you do. It's a sacrifice for the world Hugo loves. If the game is connected to you as a player in the way that it intends, then this is a really emotional moment. The first impression here that I've seen from some people is that this moment is just an excuse to kill off an important character to score some emotional points. I only agree with this in the sense that this moment comes quite abruptly. I don't think this ending is paced well, but I think it at least makes complete sense when viewed against the rest of the narrative. First of all, Hugo's death is foreshadowed heavily throughout the game. In fact, the foreshadowing started before the game even released. If the first game is subtitled Innocence, and it's about two young siblings losing their innocence, then what the hell does the subtitle of Requiem mean? Well, the word isn't just there to make the title sound generic, it's actually a religious word, particularly in the Catholic context. It refers to a mass which takes place during someone's funeral. It's about commemorating a person's death. So, death is foreshadowed, sure, but this isn't specific to Hugo. During the game, Hugo talks a lot about death, specifically his death. In his island dream, he's worrying that he's dying, and he's understandably scared of his own mortality.
Is this dying? I don't want to die.
But halfway through the game, he shows signs that he's begun to accept the possibility of death. It worries Amicia much more than Hugo at this point.
You know, it's not important if I die.
What? What are you talking about?
The Magister Vaudan told me I'm going to die.
God, no, Hugo, I'm so sorry. It won't happen.
Don't be sad. I'm happy to be here.
And, of course, by the end of the game, he's fully accepted his death. You can track the progression of Hugo's relationship with mortality until he eventually accepts it. Besides being foreshadowed, this ending is actually mirrored by the antagonists of the game. You could be forgiven for thinking that the Count is just some mean, angry guy who just wants to do some villain stuff. but he's actually entirely motivated by love. To give himself and his wife Emily hope, despite Emily's infertility and her alluded to poor mental state, the Count tells her a lie about her right to a child who carries the macula. The Count is trying to maintain a sense of control over their situation. He's told a lie for so long, though, he doesn't know how to approach reality outside of this lens. The lie began as an idea of hope, which mutated into a cult. The Count's hope was grounded in love, though. Humans inflict a lot of misery upon one another, and this isn't necessarily done out of some kind of distilled hatred, but instead, these things like bigotry, the mistreatment of groups that we don't understand, it all tends to come from a place of love within our own tribe. Behind the hatred and despair, there's hope that the world can be a better place for the people that we love, which is not to say it's justified. In Plague Tale, this happens through misguided hope, which left unchecked can blind us from doing the right thing. Of course, the result of the Count's denial had a bitter end for both his wife and himself. In contrast, Amicia and Hugo make the leap to accepting the truth of their situation. Hugo can't end things himself though, and he needs Amicia to be the one to take his life. This is a process which is arguably a much larger sacrifice for Amicia, who has to live with this moment and the loss which comes with it. It's ultimately an act of love for Hugo though, bringing everything back to the heart of the game, that being their relationship. It's a demonstration of accepting an impossibly difficult truth. The truth that violence was the inevitable consequence of denial. The only way for Hugo to have any peace was to sacrifice his life. Ultimately, a sacrifice for all of the things that he loved. Amicia, his friends, and all of the flowers and feathers that made the world beautiful. To symbolize the sacrifice, Hugo's placed in a crucifixion position, which is a pretty explicit way to do this. Now, I'm not religious, and even I was offended. It's pushing the self-seriousness of this moment a little bit. In any case, the sacrifice means that Amicia has breached the boundary of acceptance that she doesn't have control over Hugo's situation, and her struggle with violence finally has a chance to end. What's most interesting to me, though, is that the main thematic through line of the game is communicated not only through this scene, but also, more importantly, through the gameplay which comes just before this scene. As you search for Hugo in the eye of the Macula Storm, you come across these phoenix statues. These are the exact same statues that you see during the mini open world section on the island. The game has already trained you to follow where the birds point, so that's naturally what you as a player do here. This will go on for a long time though. Forever actually. Since to make any progress in finding Hugo, you need to do the opposite. Run behind the phoenix statues. The whole game has been about trying to find a cure for Hugo, and in this moment, the only way to make it back to him is to accept that there is no salvation from the macula. But Amicia's acceptance is done through the player, where the player has to realize the futility of walking along a path with no destination. Next, you reach a fire. The humanoid monsters constructed from hundreds of rats emerge from the ground and attack. As a player, you naturally fight back and stay within the safety of the light. After all, that's what the game has conditioned you to do. You can stand there, slinging ignifer after ignifer to burn away the towers of rats. You reload your sling, throwing stone after stone after stone until you figure out the trick, because once again, the game is trying to trick you here. And if you wait long enough, Hugo will tell you that it's Amicia's hope which is causing the rat titans to continue spawning.
It's your hope. But you can still fix things. And you did. Just like this flame used to.
The only way to end it is to show that you've understood this. The solution is to snuff out the fire. To give up.
There! I get it! This is pointless!
The game's core message is communicated through the gameplay systems themselves. As a player, you have to abandon the instincts instilled by the rest of the game and accept that a perpetual violence was never a solution. This is the real reason why I brought up Brothers: A Tale of Two Sons earlier. That game is an exemplary case of having the core message of a story delivered through the gameplay, and the expectations set by the game's systems. Pulling the left trigger to swim home as the younger brother is the same approach as having to put out the final fire to get to Hugo. I'm not going as far to say that it's as effective in Playtale, but it's nevertheless an impressive move. Now, it would seem rather pessimistic to want the lasting experience of the game to be one that says holding on to hope is a worthless endeavour. But I don't think what Playtale has to say is totally dour. Hope, of course, is not necessarily unfavourable. It drives us forward towards our goals, but we ought to pay attention to the lengths at which we go, because sometimes that hope can blind us. The heart of a Plague Tale is still the brother-sister bond, and the cautionary tale of false hope doesn't change this. The game still holds their bond in high regard. If it weren't for their connection, and if not for the acceptance Amicia had to eventually reach, Hugo would not have been able to end things on his own terms at all, and the ending would be even more miserable. There's also an epilogue for the game where Amicia is living alone in the mountains 1 year after this event. Her new purpose in life is to leave behind the story of the macula for the next carrier and protector. The epilogue allows some closure in playing out the story on a more emotionally balanced note, but there's not a whole lot more significance here as far as I can gather, outside of showing us what Amicia, Sophia and Lucas are up to now. And as well to show that Amicia still has a worthwhile purpose as she continues to grieve Hugo, so not all hope is unproductive. The conclusion here is confident in saying what it wants to say, and as I've shown, it manages to leverage the gameplay into this as well. I appreciate Requiem's brazen attempt to actually use its world to pose serious questions about what it means to be in a situation outside of our control while upholding our core values. This is helped in no small part by the much more deliberate commitment to a grounded story, which, while not perfect in consistency, manages to present something I can take seriously. So what does this game mean in a broader context? Asobo had an uphill battle to sell a game with the optics of a AAA blockbuster, but with a fraction of the budget. It needed to have something that doesn't exist in any other game that someone could just pick up off the shelf. The heartwarming bond between Amicia and Hugo is told really well, and this is where I think its soul is. It's a game where you can feel a lot of the passion behind the surface, the sibling bond being the best example of this. But the resonant narrative elements are enhanced beyond what the writing alone achieves, thanks to the gameplay design. Otherwise, and I ask myself this about a lot of other games, why even tell these stories through the medium of games in the first place? That's not to say gameplay and narrative can't ever coexist in their own bubbles either. I have a lot of thoughts here, but this would be its whole own video. Storytelling isn't the only strength Asobo has shown off in Requiem though. They also flaunt an impressive technical showcase. There's no doubt that the game has a unique visual fidelity which stands among some of the best in class, but even more impressive is the implementation of their Rat Horde system. I mean, come on, they can show 300,000 of these things at once, and the game still runs. While this is all impressive, it's not actually all that surprising. Asobo has a history of technological prowess. Their experience ranges from, of course, conventional video games, but also to making games for Xbox's Kinect, as well as 2 augmented reality games for the Microsoft HoloLens, which these days is used mostly for education and business. I find it particularly impressive that Asobo was the studio behind Fuel, a 2009 open-world racing game which held the Guinness World Record for the largest playable area in a console game at the time. And, of course, it's hard to deny the technical achievement of simulating the topography of the entire actual Earth using Bing Maps in Microsoft Flight Simulator. It's insane to me that this is actually a real video game. I bring all of this up to say, Asobo is kinda slept on. It's a studio with a litany of demonstrable technical abilities, and with Plague Tale, they've also shown a capacity to deliver a world and story with real creativity. I don't see this studio get enough credit, and I'm excited to see what else they're capable of. Having reached the end of the journey through A Plague Tale Requiem, it's become clear that the game is more than just a collection of disparate gameplay systems and story beats. While not flawless, it's a testament to the power of storytelling in video games. I'm not saying that Requiem is a hidden gem of masterful storytelling, but it really does have something special for the space within which it competes, the AAA narrative-driven video game. I'm excited to imagine a world where the approach for using gameplay to tell a story is more standard and more varied. Video games as a medium is still very young, and considering that Brothers: A Tale of Two Sons is over 10 years old, and there's still very few games which expand on this type of design, there remains a lot of untapped potential in video game storytelling. Turning back to Plague Tale, we can look to the future. Chateau has said that this is the end for now, but has implied that depending on the success of the game, there may be more to come. Considering that, as of writing this script, over 3 million people have played through Amicia and Hugo's Mediterranean Odyssey, and with Focus Entertainment already collaborating with Asobo on a new venture, the prospects for continuing the Tale of Plagues are intriguing. My perspective here is that Amicia and Hugo's story is finished, and a fresh canvas might be a better opportunity for Asobo to expand their ability to weave together storytelling and game making. This is especially true given that, between the two Plague Tale games, Asobo has learnt a lot of lessons in constructing a compelling world. Despite this part of me anticipating a new IP, if Requiem has taught me anything, it's that to truly appreciate the artistry in the world around us, it's important to let go of rigid expectations. So, I'm willing to embrace whatever comes next from Asobo. I feel compelled to approach the future with trust and acceptance, respecting the very lessons etched within the heart of their games.